And you go through every war, they're always, you know, their position is there's no enemy, there's no North German plane, there's no place to use our tanks. In any case, also, they do understand the horror of war and the death of war, and they're reluctant to do it for that reason as well. Now, once you start a war, then the military's position is, now we have to win it. Now we want more troops. Now we want permission to bomb in a larger area. We want to win the war. And so the lesson is, before you start a war, understand where they're going to take you.
Obviously, there has to be a solution to this, and the United States can't do all these things. There are strong international laws against wars and against occupations. How do we go about enforcing those? How do we get America out of the business of having to do all this?
Well, the problem, I mean, I think the charter is clear. As clear as the Constitution is. But it creates the same kind of problem. I mean, you know, look at Kosovo. There was no chance of getting a Security Council mandate for that. Most people, including the legal advisor's office in the State Department, told us that it was illegal. And I think many of us felt, and many people in Europe felt, that we are not going to stand by and allow this to happen a second time because the Russians would veto it. You know, Kofi Annan was asked about, does he believe that the Charter prohibits the use of force to prevent genocide? And what about Rwanda? You know, in Rwanda we probably could have gotten a Security Council resolution, and I think it's the fault of the Clinton administration that we did not. But what if you could not have gotten one? Kofi Annan's answer is, if there was a veto in the Security Council of using force in Rwanda, and somebody said that the Charter now prohibits states from acting on their own, there's something wrong with the Charter. And I have to say I agree with that. So I think, you know, we want the Charter to work to prevent aggression. We want the Charter to work to prevent states from using military force for their own political purposes. We want that not to interfere with certain kinds of humanitarian interventions. I think that means you try to get an interpretation, a common understanding of the Charter, that with limits of what you can do and how far you can go, lets you make these kinds of interventions. And we have to live up to the Charter. That's why I thought the first Gulf War was an easy coup. Because Saddam Hussein invaded another country, another member of the UN, and absolutely naked aggression. Now, he claimed that Kuwait was really part of Iraq, but it was a sovereign country, a member of the UN, and it was a violation of the Charter. And if we're serious about the Charter being enforced, we had to enforce it there. And of course, then it was possible because we were in this brief honeymoon period with the Russians, and the Chinese had not yet emerged. We got the Security Council to authorize the defense, and yet many people in this country, including an overwhelming majority of the Democratic Party, were against it. And you don't enforce those norms if you don't live up to the responsibilities that go with it. Yes.
You said, you just said stand by. Previously you said your Clinton administration couldn't sit by. And I'm thinking, you know, you bring up Rwanda, there's the Sudan. We not only can we sit by, but our chair is in our living room. That's where we sit. We shouldn't be sitting in other people's living rooms. I know it's terrible, and we should do everything we can to help people who are in that kind of a position, especially again, in Sudan right now, which we're not doing anything about. And we're sort of cherry-picking that. But as far as we can't sit by, we sat by and watched Tiananmen Square. We sat by and watched Czechoslovakia. We sat by. It's not our. John Quincy Adams, I believe, is the one that said it's not our job to not sit by. Whatever they are doing, as awful as it is, we just cannot. We don't have the resources to begin with. We lose our people. They die. If we were really serious about the Charter, if we're really serious about not sitting by, we should have troops all over the world. In the Congo, we should have troops. We should have troops in in Sri Lanka. I don't understand. We can't sit by. I never did understand that. Truman couldn't sit by while the Chinese were advancing. Johnson couldn't sit by while the North was advancing. I think we have to sit by sometimes. We can't do that. We can't stop the world from doing what it does.
I mean, I think that's right. We can't stop everything. And there are cases where we need to sit by. But I think there are also cases where we do not need to sit by and should not. And I think, in my view, you have to look at both what is happening, how terrible it is, and at what price you think you can have a chance to stop it. In the case of Rwanda, for example, I think everybody believes that 3,000 Western soldiers could have stopped that slaughter. The soldiers that were on the ground, the general that was there, pleaded for authority to protect people. In the case of Kosovo, we concluded that the Serbian army could be defeated at relatively little cost. It turns out the Serbian army is smaller than the Belgian army. And people were about to be subject to a genocide in that country, as they were in Sarajevo. And I think we could have stopped, as we finally did, stopped the siege of Sarajevo, and relatively easily. Sudan is much harder, and I think that we have to ask about each of these cases, how horrible is it, and what can we do about it within some kind of reason about the resources that we bring to bear. And those questions are never easy. But I don't think the answer is that we have to intervene everywhere, anytime anything's going on. But I also don't think the answer is that we never should be willing to intervene, preferably through the UN, always with others, in my view. But there are cases in which I think that you do have to act.
So I wonder why Sudan is harder than Afghanistan.
Oh, I don't think it's harder in Afghanistan. I'm not sure we're doing the right thing in Afghanistan, but Sudan is much harder than Rwanda was, and even than Kosovo was, because it's, there are many different military forces there. The question of the role of various sides in the conflict and what kind of force you have to put in to stop it is just much more complicated. Doesn't mean, I think we ought to be doing more than we have been. I think we should have been for a long time, but it's not clear how you bring military force to bear in that.
Just start a free market there, that's all.
Well, that is,
you mentioned that Congress's typical unwillingness to want to make the decision about war, but of course Congress doesn't want to give us better schools or give us health care or give us workers' rights or do anything that we want Congress to do, and yet we don't give up across the board. We fight for it. And I'm wondering about this proposal that's out there to sort of amend the War Powers Act, which I would argue is already weakening the Constitution, to really water it down to the point of making Congress consultants. We don't want Congress to be consultants on energy and health care and schools and the rest of it. We certainly don't want them to just be consultants on war. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. I think the consultation would be about, in this circumstance, what the Constitution requires. In other words, the notion would be...
It requires that Congress decide.
Well, it depends. Not for every use of military force. There are some, I think, where the Constitution gives the president the power to act. And so the hope would be that this would force the Congress to say, in the case of the Iraq wars or even Kosovo, this is the kind of military force that the Congress requires the Congress to act on.
But the Congress is never going to decide in its consultations that this is a case where we do have to make the decision because Congress doesn't want to. Then aren't we better off put down explicitly in law which cases Congress must decide, and then in those cases have Congress decide?
If you could pass that, yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I have no problem with arguing for that. The problem is, as we saw with the War Powers Act, Congress was all worked up. You had the Vietnam War and the height of unpopularity, the height of congressional power vis-a-vis the presidency, and it passed a law that's full of loopholes. And it's hard to imagine we get back to anything like the Congress feeling that it's capable of doing that and enacting that over veto of the president. So I would not be very optimistic about fixing the War Powers Act, which is what I think we should have done in the first place and should do now.
It does not make it worse.
Yeah, I mean, the question is whether, I mean, some people think, and I could make the argument, that repealing the current War Powers Act would make it better.
Yeah.
So it's hard to know what to do in this situation. Yes.
I want to go back before the first Gulf War. It's been my understanding that April Gillespie, who was the ambassador to Iraq at the time, and Saddam had asked her, what would the U.S. do if we invaded Iraq? And apparently